Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming this talk, which is all about food and food in the immersive world. Before I get stuck into talking about what I do and using food in immersive experiences, I want you to think about a meal that you've had in life that brings together a whole heap of emotions. So maybe the best meal that you've ever had, and it doesn't have to be in an immersive environment. It could be just be a time where loved ones were together, you were treated to something, the food was epic, but all sorts of things came together and they created a really emotive meal for you. And just think about that, and then we're going to come back to that a little bit later. So when I talk about food, and obviously as a food designer, I'm completely obsessed with food, what I talk about is the sense of sort of contentment and togetherness that eating food and enjoying food together brings. And when you're in that sense, that state of contentedness and togetherness and sitting around a table, and some people even like the kind of physical barrier, having a table in front of them to feel kind of confident and latched in life, then you are in a really receptive state. And you're in a really receptive state to be told all sorts of things, all sorts of narratives, stories, whether that be a friend just telling you about their day, whether that be your dad recounting a story that you've heard 20,000 times. But generally, you're in that state of kind of being open and open to different types of experiences coming in. And that's why I put food kind of a very central role within experiences that I design, just because of the general openness that that brings to the table. So just a little bit of background about who I am and what I've done so far to be standing here talking to you today. I was in a kind of classic marketing job for about 10 years, sitting in an office, and one day had a very early midlife epiphany that I didn't want to do that anymore. So I took myself off and did a ski season, and it was the cooking during the ski season that led me to believe that food needed to play a more central role in my life. Came back to London, retrained as a chef, and started my company Ginger Jar. And I started it straight away because in my early 30s, and as a woman, I didn't really feel like going into a commie chef job in a restaurant. So I thought, well, how can I make something that's very much my own? And I started Ginger Jar, and because I'm kind of a believer that people find you for the things that you're good at, and you find the people that believe in you, all of the clients and the people that I'd worked with when I was in the marketing world found me again and started asking me to design sort of experiential food for them. So whether that be taking the stylist to the Loire Valley to do a 3-day immersive event about Chambord and everything to do with Chambord raspberry liqueur or cassis liqueur, or whether that be more recently working with clients still, people like Volvo and TikTok and Facebook, to design food that sits within an experience that isn't just a add-on, isn't just there to kind of, grease the wheels. It's really kind of part of the experience and heightens the overall thing. So that was Ginger Jar, and then in 2017, at an event, I bumped into Suz Mountfort, one of the founders of Gingerline. So Ginger Jar, Gingerline come together, and they were looking for somebody to run their B2B experiences. So they were obviously very well established already in the B2C space, running immersive dining experiences, but didn't know too much about the B2B space, which is what I'd already been doing. So we came together, founded a company called Flavorology, and while doing that company, I took over the food design and the food delivery into all Gingerline B2C experiences at the same time. So what that meant was that by late 2019, just before COVID, when things were at the prime, we were running up to sort of 5 or 6 immersive dining experiences all at the same time. So anything from Gingerline's headline events, so like things like Chambers of Flavour 4 by that point, the Grand Expedition, TV dinners, and also for Hartshaw & Hook, we were running their Great Gatsby, a food experience that lodged onto the Great Gatsby, and the Christmas Carol that was running at the time in Mayfair, plus B2B experiences. So it was a pretty busy year just before COVID hit. What that has led me to now is obviously where I stand today. So we were still running Flavorology post-COVID, and we've ran the most recent Grand Expedition for Gingerline. But I've just started my new brand, Feast and Fable, which is all about feast being the food and fable being the story, and the two things coming together to create that kind of narrative. So just talking a little bit about Gingerline and flavorology before we get into the nitty-gritty of things. So Gingerline was born very much out of the supper club revolution, so started in 2009. Has anybody been to a Gingerline experience here? Okay, so quite well known. Have you? So Gingerline started in 2009, and by 2024 has run and designed 15 original shows, and most recently sold those shows to China and now Korea. So one of the first immersive dining companies to license those overseas. And flavorology sitting by the side, and this is something that Ollie from Swamp Motel was just talking about downstairs, because you've got the B2C engine working, you've got people buying tickets, going to something as an immersive experience, it gives you that credibility for when saying, I want to do a B2B experience, that not only have your clients got something to go to see your work already in progress, but then they just can understand the sort of depths of knowledge of things that you can design. So that conversion from the kind of B2B world to the B2C world just becomes a bit easier. Okay, so getting into how to build food within an immersive experience and how to really insert food inside an immersive experience. So just like if you were designing an immersive show, writing it for a theatre show, there's all sorts of cues that you want to give to the audience before they've even sat down. So if you imagine you're going to a restaurant, there's all sorts of information that's coming across to you before you've even sat down at the table. So whether that be, this is a really informal place, I'm going to be sat down and someone's going to scribble all over my menu, or whether or not they greet you at the door with this kind of hushed reverence that makes you be quite quiet and sort of think, okay, I'm in somewhere that's at a slightly different, more serious environment. So with food, it isn't always just about the food that's on the plate. It's also about the experience and the wrapping that comes around it, the service style, everything that comes to it before you actually get to sit down. And then through food, because most people in this country were really lucky to have a very diverse culture when it comes to food, lots of different cuisines cooked and sold around the UK, we can tell all sorts of stories and all sorts of things without necessarily even naming a dish. So we can use service styles and food styling to show a point in history that you might be at, whether that be eating a medieval banquet or whether that be eating something that's very retro, set in the 1970s. We can also tell people where they are in the world through food. So not just a country, but potentially just regionally. So are we taking them on a journey from London to Yorkshire? Are we taking them from Kerala in the south of India to the hills in the north, and the cuisine and how that changes and moves through it, dialect and language and how we talk about the food as it goes. And that obviously comes to the point of how the performers interact with the food. So what are they saying? How are they talking about it? How are they really kind of giving you all this information about the food and the narrative that comes through it? And I think when it comes to narrative, which like with any kind of immersive show, when it comes to the food design, the idea is which one comes first. So is it the food design or is it the actual story? And normally it starts with a story and the food comes through, because the food can be a little bit more flexible than the story in itself. So that's kind of normally the way around that we go when we're talking about it. Next one we're going to talk about is emotion, and this is kind of going back to what I asked you earlier. So what was your favorite meal that you had, or what kind of emotions did it kind of bring for you? We did a job for News UK out in Cannes at the Cannes Lion Festival, which told a 5-course roller coaster of emotion through food. So starting from the idea that when you arrive at a banquet or you arrive at any kind of event, the first thing you want to do is make people feel comfortable. So you don't necessarily, with an immersive experience, want to throw them straight, out into something. They don't want to come through the door and hit something in a wall straight away. So how can you create a welcome experience or a welcome course or something that sets it up so that people feel, I'm safe, I'm looked after, I'm going to have fun, these people have got me, I understand that this is all going to be okay. From that point, you can use food to take you on a different journey, wherever you want that journey to go. So when we were in Cannes, we took them straight next to surprise and delight. So the idea is, I've got you safe, what can I do with you next? And we take the emotion up a level, so show them something new, show them something they haven't seen before, and whether that be a real kind of clash between the performance and the food, something they have to do with the food, they have to interact with it, they have to go find it, they have to build it, anything that you can do to really kind of engage people in a way that they haven't really seen before. Then, once they're in that state, you can go lots of different ways. You do need to end on a high with food generally, but you can go in lots of different ways. So we went to sadness, and we went through anger, where there was plate smashing and dessert smashing and all sorts of stuff going on. But generally, you won't need to end with food. With a food experience, you need to end on a bit of a high. And just as an example of this, so a couple of years ago, we went along to the Burnt City, which is obviously near here, Punch Drunk's Burnt City, with the idea of looking at how we could fit food within that experience, mainly for the corporate audience. And I went through it. I don't know who's been through that show here, probably quite a lot of people. It's quite terrifying at moments, and it sort of really hits you deep inside. And if you think about what your stomach's doing at that point, you're not really that receptive to wanting to eat. So when we looked at that show, and you want to think about, okay, if you take something like the Burnt City as a classic example, how do I put food inside that? You need to find a moment of levity. So you need to think, I'm going to change the narrative. There's maybe a third space that I go out into. Something else happens in the show. It gives me a moment and a breather that I can actually feel like I want to eat in, and then you can take people back into the show. But emotion and finding the right emotion for people to feel like they want to eat and enjoy an experience is really key to any kind of really good food experience. The next thing we're going to talk about is how immersive to go. So I'm not going to talk about what is immersive, because I think that's probably been covered quite a lot today. But we've obviously talked about immersive, experiential, concept, theming, all of this kind of stuff. And the main thing that we talk about is how immersive, is it truly immersive, and how immersive do you go? And the answer is really, how have you built it, and what do you want people to feel? So if you've build it as an immersive dining experience, and lots of people now understand that word and have been to things that they feel to be truly immersive, then you really need to go that far. It's not okay to just do a kind of Bridgerton or Willy Wonka, where people are turning up and having something that's a light version or a themed version of something. But also, full immersive is not necessarily always relevant. So if you think about the audience and you think about what they want to get out of the night, Christmas and audiences don't want fully immersive in the same way as somebody that's designing to go out for a kind of a night out with a group of friends and have chosen to book an immersive experience. Sometimes actually experiential, but enough time for people to chat to themselves and not be taken out of their lives and into an immersive experience is the way to go. So when you're designing something with food inside it, how immersive and how far you take it is a really kind of interesting question. Also, it's really about the kind of structure of the show. So if you think about what I would consider to be truly an immersive show, you need to be thinking outside of yourself. So you need to be thinking, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner, I'm not thinking about work tomorrow, I'm really kind of truly immersed in this show. And that's more difficult to do the larger the audience size. So Gingerline's Chambers of Flavour is a really good example of how cutting the audience size down to a group of 16 people who travel through an experience, rather than it always being 100 people in a room at the same time, is a good example of how to do that. So you can capture the room, the performer can hold that room, they can make sure that we're not having a chat over here about what somebody's boyfriend's doing, we're making sure that something else isn't happening over here. We're actually really kind of owning that room and owning the tone of the room and how people move through. The minute that you go into a larger audience, there's way more room for people. So for example, you guys could be having a chat over there, people could wander off and have a talk over there. And it's much harder to gain that really true sort of immersive idea, the bigger the audience style, or certainly the bigger the audience style all at once. And I mean, Punch Drunk, just going back to them again, if you look at something like Drowned Man, the mask and the fact that you are completely split up from your friends and you are depersonalized as you go through that experience is an incredible tactic for making sure that you stay in the moment. You don't have the ability to talk to other people. You don't have the ability to break the narrative and step outside of that. obviously we can't do that with food. So we can't get to the point where you're blocked and you're sort of away from your friends. But it is something to bear in mind if anybody is designing an immersive experience, is to really think about the audience size, how to break that down, how to keep people in a world as much as you can. Next thing that we're going to talk about is about making money from food experiences. So this is something that has become harder and harder to achieve. Pre-COVID, the ticket price on an immersive dining experience was probably half what it is now, maybe 2/3. And some of the costs of that, when you come back, are the fundamental costs that are really across the board when it comes to food. So chefs, waiting staff, all of that kind of stuff has gone up. The cost of food itself has gone up, and the power needed to cook food has gone up. So how do you take the client with you? How do you take the guest with you? How do you make them understand that they might be having a similar experience that they had pre-COVID, but actually it's going to cost them twice the price? And the main thing to really think about is to kind of ensure that whatever you're doing it properly. So if you can't achieve what you were doing pre-COVID, you can't achieve the same level of food, how do you reskin that, or how do you cut it up in a different way so that you can make it more achievable for your audiences? And that could be that you don't have a full sit-down dining experience that you might have done before. So if you look at the Great Gatsby show that we did, it didn't make sense for food to be fully all the way through the experience, but it does make sense for it to be potentially an hour and 10-minute experience at the beginning of the show. And that in itself is going to cost a lot less to produce and create than a full dining experience that sits within the show, hitting all of the beats of the main show. Or maybe it's a question of looking at how food sits outside of the main ticket price. So if you think about going to Disneyland and buying a £100 ticket to get into Disneyland, but then all of the other upsells that you have when you're there, so every Coke that you buy, every piece of merch that you buy, everything else that happens outside of that first ticket price, how do you make that sort of model appropriate for what you're doing here? And you really have to, I think, post-COVID, be definitely more flexible in the way that you think about building food within an experience. Because the main thing is not to promise something and not to be able to deliver it. And I think that one thing that we would say about the kind of food experiences now is that if you are making compromises within the show that you wouldn't make to set, or you wouldn't make to performance, or you wouldn't make to venue and location, then don't make them with food, because it will come through to the reviews. And it does happen that you have to be able to sort of deliver on what it is that you are kind of promising. Okay, this is, I suppose, coming back to the sort of practical side of it, really. So what does it take to actually deliver an immersive experience behind the scenes? And the reality is a lot. So if you think about having to create something within the beats of a show, so if you go for dinner, if you go to a tasting menu, it's very rare that everybody in this room would be fed all at once. So you'd have the waiting staff and the booking system would make sure that people aren't all sitting down at once, so that the number of staff that they've got can deal with them, they can call away mains away, they can make sure you finish your dish before I'm going to send your dish. Within an immersive dining environment, you don't have that luxury. You are with the show, you are with the timing of the show. So if performer A does act C, then that's when the trigger is for the next thing to go. And it doesn't matter if people before haven't finished their dinner, or it doesn't matter if the oven's not working very well. The timing is still moving on and still moving on. So the main thing you've got to really think about is having enough people and enough skilled people behind the scenes to really think about how you're going to achieve that. The ambition of the show, I mean, Chambers of Flavour being the kind of ultimate example, and I have Davey down here to thank for a few of the challenges that we had with that show, but you might have the point where you need to have a hot course pre-existing in a room when people enter it, and it needs to sit there for 5 minutes, and when it's eaten, it still feels and looks as good as it was when it entered the room before you entered the room. Or you might have a frozen course that somehow needs to appear, but the timing's running late because somebody needed to leave and go to the loo, and then have just come back and the whole thing's running late. So the kind of cogs and the thought process behind food production and food delivery within an immersive environment is completely different to the running of a restaurant or the running of any kind of other sort of catered situation. So it's really kind of understanding at the design process and at the menu design process a kind of rise and fall of hot courses, cold moments where the kitchen team and the service team can catch up, props that do some of the work for you. So it might be an incredibly easy-looking course, but because it's a kind of interactive build your own with a kind of prop heavy and performance heavy part, it gives your team a little bit of a breather to then have a moment to get together a full hot course after that. So it's really thinking about the kind of rhythm of the menu design and how it's going and what's actually going to be achievable through the night. So they're the main tips that I have for putting food within an immersive experience. Has anybody got any questions for me at this point?
Hiya, thanks so much. That was really insightful. Just a quick question about dietary requirements. How would you tackle that in terms of an immersive experience so you don't break that kind of where you're asking people gluten-free, are they vegetarian? Is that sort of a pre-thing you do, or is there something where if you're kind of like showcasing food, is there a creative way that you do that in order to make sure everyone's safe and eating what they need to and want to?
Yeah, wristbands are your so certainly if people are moving within an experience, then a wristband system, I suppose, that tags those. So if it's an easy dietary, so I'm vegetarian, I'm gluten-free, I'm vegan, then obviously that wristband can go with you. But if it's more complex, then that'll be a special one, and it'll be tagged with what it is that they have. And it's really about knowledge. So luckily now, the performance teams that we've worked with really understand the importance of that. So when the food comes into the room, they'll know if they've got, now it could be 5, 6, 7 out of 16 people that have something that is a requirement. So it's making sure that they get the right thing and that they lock eyes and say, this is my thing, this is my meal, I agree that has no peas in it, that's what I asked for. So that's the only really way that we found to go through it. I mean, at Chambers of Flavour, there's an incredibly complicated service screen through that because you've got 16 people entering every 20 minutes, half an hour, and you've got to follow their dietary requirement all the way around the room, through 7 different courses. So it's a question of, being clever and finding out where they are and then tracking them to make sure they get the right thing. But generally with our immersive dining menus, there's never a point where a vegan is just getting spinach tortellini. They are still getting an immersive meal. They are still getting a version of that meal that has as few allergens as possible. So we design actually with a lot of plant-based stuff now. We design with a lot less, mustard, soy, things like this that are kind of classic. We try and take that out at the point of design. And then that just means that we've got less things to think about when it comes to the main delivery.
I have 2 questions. One, when you're budgeting for the amount of food that you're going to have and you sort of hope that you reach that budget, but you're not quite sure, is there any way to sort of predict how much food to over or produce enough of, or if you're going to run short or not use all of it?
Yeah.
And the other question, sorry, I'm asking too, is there's a certain set, if you have a certain amount of time that people have to eat, are there any devices that you use to kind of deal with the slow eaters and people who just kind of take their time and you don't want to disturb the experience and rush them or cut them off? Is there anything?
Yeah. So going back to the first question, can you just remind me what the first question was? Over budgeting, okay. So I think this is something that's really good when it comes to immersive dining, certainly in the B2C world, because generally it's pre-sold. So there'll always be a conversation between the ticketing team and the kitchen team. The kitchen team will tell the ticketing team to cut off sales way earlier than they want to, and the ticketing team will still keep selling them. But essentially, you're always trying to work to a number. And if you've got certainly within a plated experience, then it's much easier to hit that number. In a shared experience, a feasting style experience, then you tend to need to over budget by about sort of 10 to 20% to allow for the plates not to look kind of naked after the last person's taken their part. And actually, to that point, I prefer a plated experience when it comes to menu design because I can do that. I can create no waste. I'm controlling that portion size. Like in any kind of tasting menu, I'm controlling how much you're eating and how many people are coming through the door. So you very rarely have waste. Almost zero waste. And especially that also comes back to the cycle of food design. So, you've obviously got staff to feed as well. You've got waste that you're trying to move into, so you've got more of a zero waste menu. So you're using different kind of things in pickles and ferments and all sorts of interesting stuff. But yeah, in a B2C experience, it's generally much easier to control waste because you know what your ticket sales are. In a B2B experience, when it's to the general public, I would always opt for a ticketed experience of some kind as well, mainly for two reasons. One, to make sure people turn up, because if they don't believe there to be a value to the thing, then it's very throwaway. So even if it's a £10 or £15 ticket price on something that actually gets them £100 worth of experience, it makes sure they turn up and links all the way back to no waste or much less waste, because you can predict exactly who's coming. And then the second question was the slow eater. That's really tricky. It's really tricky. Sometimes you've just got to... Performers can do things that servers can't do. So if somebody's in character as a performer in scene, then they can get away with treating people in a way that a server couldn't. So they can just do it in a funny way, do it in a kind of in-role way, make sure that people are on board with that joke, and that over time they'll develop a way of being able to move it forward. But it is always better to get a performer in character to do something like that than ask a server to.
What's your favourite thing to eat at the moment?
Oh gosh. This is a really, really tricky one, I think, because as I'm a typical chef in that I love really, really, really good food, but I also eat very bad food, very often. I think there was a thing the other day where I was stuck on a train and I had half a packet of old Frutella, very old Frutella for my dinner. But the things I like to eat when I've got time to do it are actually quite clean flavors at the moment, so much more kind of Japanese style or sort of just cleaner, sort of less ingredient but higher value ingredient style things at the moment, things that are less processed, apart from pickle and fermenting, which I still love, but yeah.
Hi, I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about the relationship between like a dining experience and a ticket price, like the food element and the ticket price, because I'm noticing that like a lot of immersive experiences at the moment are really struggling to figure out what to charge in a post-COVID landscape. And I think it seems to be that dining experiences seem to have it figured out a lot more, that like what they're charging seems to be an amount customers are happier with than what just straight up immersive experiences are charging, even though there are these challenges. So I just wonder if we could talk about ticket price and immersive dining a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to start with budget. So it has to start with what you can actually realistically deliver. So I know that when we sat down and looked at the sort of B2B experiences B2C experiences post-COVID, you've really got to start with how much it's going to cost me to do. And that's when I sort of say, okay, well, if it's going to cost you £40 per person to produce, and that's actually not an unrealistic figure. If it's going to cost me £40 per person to produce, then now I'm thinking, okay, well, I still need to make 30-40% on that. Then I've got all of the performance, and then the venues cost more than it did before, and that's where you see ticket prices going from the sort of £70-80 to the bare minimum £150 plus upsell of the champagne bottle before I've clicked it, upsell of the VIP area, upsell of the slightly closer things. So all of the tactics, I suppose, that the West End have been doing for like years and years and years when it comes to that banding, immersive dining and just immersive theatre generally is getting on board with to try and make sure that they can say in their marketing that the opening price is £150. The realistic value is that if most people are coming, will be spending more than that, but they might not be getting anything within that price that's actually more expensive to produce. But it has to come from how much it costs. That's the thing, and how much value you get for that. So if it's a 5-course menu and you're realizing I just can't afford to do this within the ticket price because I want to cap, I want to say £149 at the end, I can't produce these 5 courses within that, then how do you create value but deliver slightly less? And that's when menu design, I suppose, comes in higher. So, using cheaper cuts, all of the tactics, I suppose, that the tasting menus have been using these days, but using cheaper cuts, doing more work at the chef end, doing more work with pickling, fermenting, presentation, props, things that are reusable, but not the kind of, the core ingredient being like really, really high.
Sorry. I've noticed there's been more high-end immersive experiences happening. So Key of Dreams, Dead on Time, Monarch Theatre, which I especially loved. Are you seeing more of those cropping up on your radar? And how do we get food to be more of a... So I like Gingerline, but if there's people willing to pay £150, £200 for a ticket, are we going to be seeing more of those in the future?
I think, I was having a conversation just before this talk about this. I think that, yes, but we have to change the demographic. So if you want to have tasting experiences that are starting at £150 with a full production and all that kind of stuff, then the demographic is changing. The younger market can't afford that. So it used to be that the audiences we were seeing would start in their early 20s. You would get people in their 40s and 50s, but generally you're looking 20s, 30s, early 40s that were going to this stuff. Now you're looking at that West End audience, you're looking at the people that all of this kind of movement in our budget hasn't really affected as much, because to move out of the kind of 70 quid value and go into 151, and actually what you're getting for that hasn't changed that much, then you have to kind of start to move the demographic with you. But I think when I'm looking at experiences around, it's not unusual for ticket prices to be going over £300 now, and they don't necessarily have to be immersive. That can be an evening with Michel Roux. That can be, very much a dining experience at its core. So then, if you take that dining experience and you're saying, I want this Michelin star premium fine dining, and add a whole lever, essentially a whole West End show on top of that, then obviously the ticket price has to go up. Okay. All right, I think we're done. Thank you for coming, everybody.